Hello and welcome to these sessions that have been created in honor of all South Africans who feel a degree of fear and powerlessness in the light of the corona pandemic, the economic climate, and the high rate of gender-based violence here. These sessions are aimed at understanding more about power. And why would we want to know more about power? Power comes through knowledge. So this is all about getting more power to you. Power offers you greater freedom of expression and more opportunity to experience non-violent and respectful relationships. The 9th of August is Annual Women's Day in South Africa. So these sessions take a look at the specific issue of gender-based violence that puts women especially at a vulnerable disadvantage in terms of power. And so let's begin with part 1, an overview, looking at power, sex, violence, and language in South Africa. Who do you consider to be the most powerful person or the most powerful institutional structure in your world? How come? What gives them this power? Do you sometimes find that this power feels oppressive? Maybe the power they have over you is fueled by fear of some sort. Keep this in mind as you continue to listen. South Africa is said to have a culture of violence. We hear about sex-related violence on a daily basis. Violent sex scandals are in the news, they're on social media, and they are regularly viewed in popular movie scenes. They are on the TV. Sex stories sell, violence sells, and the money it generates buys power for some. Sex-related violence and power are interlinked because power is often maintained and perpetuated via the use of or the threat of violence. Consider these questions. What did you do this past week in order to avoid gender-based violence? Maybe you avoided going out alone after dark. Maybe you stayed on the main road rather than using a quieter shortcut because it felt safer to be in a more public space. Maybe you chose clothing that was not fitted to your body shape so as not to attract unwanted attention. Maybe you wore shoes that you would be able to run in case running away became necessary. Maybe you found yourself disconnecting from news reports, media, and movies that contain sex-related violence because they affect your ability to sleep or your ability to cope and interact in balanced ways from day to day. If you could relate to these questions, or if you had similar examples of your own, then perhaps you are experiencing fear based on the vulnerability of your gender, especially here in the South African context. Perhaps you are concerned that the current justice system does not adequately protect women, the LGBTQIA people, and children who are at risk from gender-based violence. So who and what holds power here in South Africa? It would seem that power is held by a system of gender-based violence that was fathered by and continues to be fed by a system of patriarchy. Patriarchy refers to dominant male rulership that uses power, control, and often violence to subjugate the autonomy, the dignity, and the gifting of people of all genders, races, classes, and cultural groupings. It seems that patriarchal leaders and institutions exert controlling power over peoples through violent tactics, or simply the fear of violence or violation, whether this be physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, economic, ecological, or socio-cultural related. Research shows that even the fear of encountering patriarchal violence exerts power over control within domestic homes and church communities. However, patriarchal power that condones the use of violence for control is unacceptable. Only God is all-powerfully good all of the time. So where is God in this issue of abusive, patriarchal, violent power then? Does God condone patriarchal power and control? Does God condone gender-based violence? How come sex-related violence appears to be socio-culturally acceptable in the light of its high prevalence here in South Africa? Do you think God can and does provide each one of us with the personal power needed in order to improve the pervasiveness of violence within our contemporary South African social culture? What role do our cultural and religious systems play in the perpetuation of sexual violence? These are tough questions. Are our cultural ideologies or our cultural ways of thinking and our religious ways of thinking interlinked in some way? The three main religions here in South Africa are namely Christian, Islamic, and Jewish. These three religious faith groups all consider God as the ultimate symbol of power. 80% of South African population adheres to some form of Christian faith, according to Index Mundi stats that were updated in 2019. So if God is all-powerfully good and all three major local religions believe in God, how come there is a problem here with violence? South Africa is said to have a culture of violence. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, how have our religious beliefs contributed towards cultural violence here? And how do they continue to do this? So let's consider our South African situation in more depth in order to unearth the roots of patriarchal violence. All 11 official languages here have a patriarchal anthropology. Leadership is still identified with masculinity. The current UNISA website, which I looked at yesterday, lists 4 men as exemplary African leaders. They are namely Desmond Tutu, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, and Shaka Zulu. No women such as Wangari Maathai are mentioned. Patriarchal culture considers male leaders, male power, and male perspectives as the norm. Patriarchal culture considers gender to be a binary concept, that is, male or female, with heterosexuality being the accepted norm. Patriarchal anthropology is therefore dualistic. Although local human rights favor equality, this fact is certainly not evident in sociocultural praxis here. South African society continues to favor men, mostly at the expense of women. Locally, women are usually considered helpmates of their husbands and thought of as second-class citizens, both in society and within the Christian church. Think about this fact for a minute. Such gender-biased assumptions cloak sexual violence in invisibility, allowing perpetrators and victims, hopefully survivors, to rationalize gender-based violence behaviors as natural, even as God-given. For example, consider the context of marital rape. While churches may not be directly responsible for the actions of their members, they have played a significant role in conveying the notion that husbands, as the head of the household, which is often preached from the pulpit, husbands have conjugal rights and wives have conjugal duties, sustaining the long-standing belief that once marriage vows are made, there is no such thing as marital rape. Intimate partner violence is not an act between two individuals. It is a violation of human dignity that damages the entire community, narrowing the range of our capacity to relate to one another and to the divine in healthy ways. In view of the prevalence of sexual violence within church circles and within communities, we can no longer ignore the patriarchal theological constructions that condone and maintain this reality. South African feminist theologian Miranda Pillay suggests that the Anglican Church of Southern Africa utilized the insight of women theologians by incorporating gender-inclusive liturgy into their church worship spaces in order to enhance equality and social justice. Gender-inclusive language will help to reduce patriarchal hierarchy understandings and gender-based violence tendencies. Feminist thought and perspective is at times itself accused of taking a violent stance against men, but this is unfounded and untrue. The fact is that feminism firmly exposes and confronts injustice and violence perpetrated against women especially, and calls for a global, egalitarian social ethic, especially in previously colonized locations such as South Africa. While South Africa has progressive human rights laws that offer protection for women and the vulnerable, such as minority groups and children, the challenge is the implementation of these laws. Transformation away from unjust structural violence towards egalitarian participation in Christ-likeness is at the heart of feminist theology, and it is also at the heart of these sessions. Thank you for listening. Please click like and subscribe or follow to hear part 2 of these sessions on power, sex, violence, and language in South Africa. Part 2 offers more power to you by providing practical ways in which we can each personally take a stance against the culture of violence.